YouTube theologians, Pastor Wolfmueller here. Today we had, as the epistle lesson at the Deaf Church, Romans chapter 6, where St. Paul says, don't you know that if you're baptized, there's all these with Christ things that have happened. Romans 6, you've been buried with Christ. You will also be raised with Christ to walk in newness of life. You've been crucified with Christ. You died with Christ. That word, you could circle the word with in the text. With Christ. All these, the things that happened to Jesus are now, they now belong to you by baptism. I remember Ryan and Casey were working on memorizing this text. I think I've told you the story before. And you have to imagine the text because St. Paul preaches with pictures. Well, almost Jesus preaches with pictures. The Psalm, David preaches with pictures. You're asking in the Bible, what's the picture? And like in Isaiah 55, the rain and the snow comes down. It doesn't return void. It doesn't snow up. It snows down. That's how the Lord's word is. Or the sower goes out to sow the seed. That was the gospel lesson. Well, anyway, the picture is that can you imagine you're there in the crowd on Crucifixion Day, Good Friday, and you're standing next to Jesus, and Pilate condemns Jesus, or at least hands him over, and Pilate looks at you and says, "What are you doing here?" And you said, "I'm with him." And he says, "Okay, you're with him." So they take you to Golgotha too, and you are there, crucified with Christ. And you're in agony with Christ. You cry out to the Father, and my God, why have you forsaken me? With Christ. You commend your spirit to the Father with Christ, and then you breathe out and die with Christ. Paul says it in Galatians like this: I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live. It's Christ who lives in me. But not just crucified, you died with Christ. And then you're buried. So they come and they take Jesus off the cross. And they take you off the cross. And they hastily wrap Jesus' body for burial and hastily do the same to your body and hustle to the tomb, and they put Jesus in there and they put you next to him, and they roll. Can you imagine this? It's dark and damp, and they rolled. It's hard to imagine when you're dead, but you have to be both dead and imagining what's happening to you at the same time. They roll the stone over, and it's sealed shut, and the air is still. And there's no heartbeat, and there's no breath. There's just darkness and silence. One day, 2 days, and then on the third day, you open your eyes and you look over at Jesus. Remember how this goes? And he's looking back at you. You are alive, you say to him. And he says, yep, so are you. What do you want to do now? Live forever. So Jesus stands up and you stand up with him, and Jesus walks out of the grave and you walk out of the grave with him. That's what baptism gives us. Oh man, I love this picture so much because Paul says it like, don't you know that you were baptized, or were buried with Christ? You died with him through baptism into death. Even as Jesus was raised from the dead, we too should walk in newness of life. So that baptism joins us together to that to that death, that suffering, that burial, that resurrection of Jesus, so that now we look at death through the rearview mirror. That's where you guys are, by the way, right? In my rearview mirror. Death is not this way. Death is this way, back there. I'm not, remember how the old existentialist philosophers, I'm no expert on this, but they had these categories. They were trying to move from rationalistic to experiential categories. So they had this idea on being toward death, like we're all inching toward the grave, getting closer and closer to our own deaths. Not you, not if you're baptized. Every day's a little further from death. Every day death is a little harder to see in the rearview mirror. We're being pulled into life. And yeah, our bodies will die for a time until the resurrection, but because of Jesus, it's a sleep. And we'll wake up. We've passed from death to life. We have, remember, this is that amazing thing where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, this famous verse, and he says, all who believe in him have eternal life. Not will have right now. We're living the eternal life right now. And this is part of the way that baptism sets us free from the fear of death. Remember, we're always working on that freedom from the fear of death. It's a persistent thing. All of us, I think, have this inborn fear of death, which in a way is helpful because it makes us cautious. You do things carefully most of the time if you can, because you don't want to die. Good. But whenever doing something that we're supposed to do comes up with the threat of death, we're not afraid to do it. We're not afraid to risk it. We're not afraid to live life on the edge if we're called to live on the edge, or if love requires us to live on the edge, because we're not afraid to die. Hebrews 2, in this most astonishing verse that tells us how Jesus was incarnate so that his death would destroy the devil, and it calls the devil him who had the power of death, and it goes on to talk about how the power of death was that through the fear of death, the devil can keep us in bondage. And the whole point of the passage is that through the death of Jesus, we are set free from the fear of death. Because it's no longer anything to be afraid of. And this is one of the ways we're set free from the fear of death. The Bible tells us we already died in baptism. And that death, by the way, the death of baptism is a particular death. It's the death of the old Adam. It's the death of the old man. It's the death of the sinful nature that we're born with, that we've inherited. So that we walk in newness of life. We walk in the freshness of the resurrection. We walk in the forgiveness of sins, which means freedom from the fear of judgment. Because for all the baptized, we are crucified, dead, buried, and raised already with Christ. God be praised. Sunday Drive.